Welcome to Delingpole, a Breitbart.com podcast. Here is the podcast host, James Delingpole.
Welcome to the Delingpole podcast with me, James Delingpole, and I am so excited about my special guest this week. We've had some pretty distinguished guests in our time on this program, but I don't think we've ever had, but I know we haven't had, an actual Cambridge professor. And I first discovered this week's guest when I read his doorstopper of a book, which is called The English and Their History, and it's become a massive bestseller. So welcome to the programme, Professor Robert Toombs.
It's a great pleasure and honour to be here.
Well, now, you have come from Cambridge, where you are a professor of, not of English, professor of French history.
Yes.
So how did you come to write? This must be one of the longest books about English history published recently. I mean, how many words is it? How many pages? It's enormous.
It's 900 and something pages, nearly getting on for 1,000 pages.
And how long did it take you to write?
About 5 years, I should think.
And were you really beavering away all that time, or was it just
Well, I was doing my day job as well. I was sort of teaching and all that, so it was a lot of weekends and a lot of evenings and early mornings. But once I got into it, I was really enjoying it, and so it didn't really seem like a great chore to do.
I mean, I'm not sucking up to you. In fact, I wouldn't even bother talking to you if it wasn't a really great book. I think it was definitely, well, everyone chose it as their favourite book of 2014, pretty much, didn't they? It was all the year's end of year's best of lists.
Well, greatly to my surprise, it's true that a lot of people liked it and were kind enough to say they liked it. And insofar as I have any merits in that, rather than the story itself being exciting, which of course it is, I think it was probably that it was new to me, as I'd spent years and years writing about France, and then suddenly thought I'd like a change. So for me, this was fun, and it was exciting, and it was a discovery. And also, above all, I didn't know too much about it, because if you know too much about a subject, you tend to get terribly dull. Yeah. And for me, it was skating across the surface and picking out the things I thought were interesting.
So, what surprised you in the course of researching this book about the English that you just didn't know?
Well, I think the thing that I had sort of had a vague idea about but didn't really know was, and I have to be careful here because it sounds awfully complacent, but we've actually been terribly lucky. I've spent my career mostly studying France and Europe, and of course their history has been one in which there have been pretty frequent disasters, by which I mean episodes in which hundreds, thousands, in some cases even millions of people have been killed. Episodes of terror, dictatorship, invasion, subjection to foreign powers and so on, of poverty, of famine, and you think, well, what was happening in England at this time? And the fact is we were pretty safe, pretty well off, usually even at the time that many historians regard as dark and dismal times. We were still the richest country in the world. And because I suppose I'd studied these other countries, I could never think of England except by making some sort of comparison. And so thinking, how poor were the poor? How rich were the rich? How many people were being arrested for political offences? How many rebellions were there? How many people were being... And usually, I mean, we're very much at the good end of the spectrum. Not because of our native virtue, though it would be nice to think that we did have that, but I think because partly we've been very lucky, and we've been partly lucky in being on an island, of course, as everyone knows, but also lucky because our government system from very early days, from the days of the Anglo-Saxons, has actually been pretty efficient, and also has managed to involve people to quite a remarkable extent. So it's been on the whole an efficiently run country, and one in which people accepted the laws and were participating in their own government. If that sounds too good to be true, of course it's not always a story of bliss and happiness. It's not a Garden of Eden, but by comparison with most of the world, we've been a pretty lucky country.
When the Normans turned up, though, didn't they rather spoil things for a while? I mean,
they did. I think that's certainly true. I mean, a lot of Victorians thought this was good. I think it was Carlyle, who said the pot-bellied Anglo-Saxons sort of waddling about were made to smarten up by the Normans. In fact, I think the Norman conquest was pretty much a disaster. And one thing that struck me about this when I discovered it was that the Anglo-Saxon nobility didn't live in castles. They lived in ordinary houses, manor houses, whatever. It was only the Normans who built fortified houses for themselves because they were a military occupier. And so Anglo-Saxon England was a pretty tough place, but it wasn't a place in which its rulers felt required to hide behind stone walls.
Do you reckon there is something in the English folk memory where we look back to Anglo-Saxon times as a sort of lost Eden, where people sort of lived in the sort of the wassailing halls and had big fat bellies and beards and everyone was jolly and we had sort of witans and things, sort of councils of the elders rather than ghastly people in those Norman helmets?
There's some truth in that. I think it was one of the medieval chroniclers who said the Normans lived poorly in big houses and the Anglo-Saxons lived richly in small houses, and I rather like the idea of that. So I think there was a fair amount of wassailing and feasting and so on. But it was a tough society. People getting blinded and mutilated and stoned to death and flogged, and there were slaves who got scalped and had their fingers cut off for misbehaving.
Well,
so
fair enough. I mean, how else are you going to keep the slaves in order?
Precisely. And the Normans did abolish slavery. That's true. But it was nevertheless a harsh and tough society in which most people seem to have felt to some extent involved, and it was a nation that had a sense of itself, I think, as one ruled by its own laws, governed by its own kings, and so on. So it was something like a nation, and many historians say it was the first political community that one could reasonably describe as a nation.
How much do you buy into the argument that in the medieval times we had the glory of our cathedrals and monasteries were very, very powerful, and then of course we had the Reformation, and then of course we had the Puritans who came in and they were iconoclasts and they rejected Britain's sort of Catholic heritage, I suppose you'd call it, and all the colour vanished, but at the same time a sort of literary tradition developed out of that. How much truth do you think there is that we wouldn't be where we are today in terms of a great trading power and so on if it hadn't been for this rejection of our Catholic colourful past, and we'd become these kind of Puritans?
That I would guess not your last bit, because after all the other Catholic powers like the Portuguese and the Spanish and the Italians, the Venetians were great trading powers. I think we'd been on the edge of Europe, and I always think of medieval England as being a kind of Australia, which was a pretty rich society, but it got rich by producing raw materials for the others. I think, and I say in the book, a couple of things I say in the book, if anyone is inclined to look.
Oh, they so must read this book, really.
One thing is that I thought that the Reformation brought about what I called a revolution of words. In other words, the written word and the spoken word become far more important than they had under the Catholic culture of the Middle Ages, in which ceremony, singing, processions and so on had been so important. Now people have to understand what they're reading. They have to understand the Bible, the prayer book, and this, I think, helps to create the language and the literature that we are now so
we
proud
became
of.
more democratic, because before you had the sort of the priests who were in charge, and afterwards, once everyone had their own Bible that they could read, thanks to printing and thanks to everything being translated in the vernacular. Is that the kind of thing? Well,
I wouldn't say more democratic, but certainly probably more individualistic, a bit more turbulent. After all, if people think that they can say what God means, they can read the Bible and they can make their own ideas about this, it obviously makes a very different kind of culture from one in which people rely on a caste of priests to tell them what God's will is. So that's one thing that I think changes. It does shape our modern literature. And probably creates the kind of far less, as you said, colourful culture than the Middle Ages. We're sitting in a neoclassical building now. Of course, this is much later, but later English architecture. Of course, the churches and cathedrals are now usually white and grey. They're whitewashed. They haven't got the colourfulness of, or very rarely of medieval churches, and we can hardly imagine how colourful a culture that was, unless perhaps you look at Hindu temples in India and see how all the statues are painted and so on. But the other thing I argue in the book, which I think is probably a bit bold, and and though no one's actually said it's rubbish, is that this creates a divide within our culture, which we still feel the consequences of. And one could say, on one hand, there is an Anglican culture, the establishment, the people who feel that somehow they're at home in this society, and the dissenting culture of those, the Puritans and later on Methodists, Baptists and so on, who feel that somehow they're outside the religious establishment and they're somehow trying to break down this citadel of privilege from without, and who often, I think of themselves as being morally and intellectually superior, but whose sense of themselves is of a rebellious minority who are being excluded from the great institutions of the state.
So you're talking about Brexit?
Well,
Proto-Brexit.
I thought you never mentioned that. But yes, I think in some senses, yes.
That was the theme bubbling under in the book. My wife noticed it as well, and you really went big on it towards the end. This was, of course, before Brexit happened.
Yes,
and I think when it looked unlikely that it would happen, at the time you were writing, it would have seemed a sort of a pretty unlikely shot.
Well, one thing that actually struck me was when I read on Eurobarometer. I don't know whether you ever consult Eurobarometer. It's the EU's official polling organisation, which regularly poll people on their views of themselves, their country, Europe, and so on. And before Brexit, in 2 or 3 years before Brexit, the British were the only people in Europe who said they thought that their country would stand a better chance of facing the future outside the EU than inside the EU. And I was not surprised. I thought if people are not scared away from voting to leave, and if there are some people who can put themselves forward as credible leaders of the Leave campaign, I thought it would probably be a vote for Leave.
But you must have been quite... Cambridge, I think, more people voted Remain. A greater percentage voted to Remain in Cambridge than in almost any other town.
Yeah, and of my colleagues, about 90%, I think.
So the day after, because you were presumably known to be a Brexiteer by then.
Well, a few people knew it, but perhaps you'd be surprised at how little people are aware of what public statements one makes. Perhaps even people may not know what your political views are, your next-door neighbours and so on.
I keep very quiet about them, I can tell you. Yeah.
I'm not a proselytiser. I don't sort of walk around parading my views. But those who did know, some of them have actually were quite encouraging and quietly said, jolly good show and all that kind of thing. The only one who's ever said to me, I think you shouldn't have said that or you shouldn't use your position like this, was in fact a medievalist colleague who's Hungarian. So I sort of understood that she would feel that this was something that she felt was a rejection of herself and which affected her position. But most people have never expressed any strong objection.
Well, I think from a historical perspective, your book may have been the one that swung it for us. So whatever little bit you did, well done, mate. Now, I wanted to ask you a very key question of English history.
Yes.
Roundhead or Cavalier?
Definitely Cavalier.
Why?
Well, I was brought up a Catholic, and of course the Catholics, although a persecuted minority, were very solidly royalist because they didn't like the Puritans. And the fact is, I don't like Puritans. I don't like 17th century Puritans, and I don't like 21st century Puritans. So I would definitely find myself on the side of the least Puritan group. And of course, I think many people don't realise this. I'm sure you do, James. But the great majority of people in the country were on the side of the king.
Really? So why did he lose then?
Well, largely, you'll say this can't be true. You'll say I'm making this up. It was largely because of the intervention of the Scots.
Ah, bloody Scots. Bloody interfering Scots, yeah. I can believe that.
Well, the Scottish army was the biggest and most powerful in these islands.
What, because they had a lot of practice from being...
They did have a lot of the... Well, not so much that, but fighting on the continent in war, in the 30 Years' War. So the Scottish army was actually... It was eventually defeated by Cromwell when they got too uppity, as it were. In fact, they changed sides. They backed the king in the end. But they were certainly the people who ensured that Parliament would win.
Isn't it interesting, though, the narrative now, very much, certainly in the last, I'd say, 20 years, because when I was at school, when I was at prep school in the 1970s, I was very much a Cavalier. And then I got sort of persuaded more recently by people said, yes, but our great parliamentary tradition, and you know, the Levellers, they were kind of proto-libertarians, and the king was a sort of Catholic, he was ultramontane, so one is encouraged nowadays to think of parliamentarians as being the real English people that are force for good.
Well, it seems to me they're somewhere between the Taliban and the Reverend Ian Paisley. If that's the sort of politics that you're attracted by, then by all means go for the Levellers.
But isn't that interesting that this is the way that history has been manipulated?
Yeah, well, what we call Whig history, as you know.
Tell me what is Whig history?
Well, it's the view which was largely put forward by, first of all, by descendants of the parliamentary side and by those who felt themselves, either for religious or political reasons, to have been on that side. To spin our history as one which was one of constant struggle between the Crown and the people, in which eventually the Whigs and then their descendants, the Liberal Party, and then their descendants, the Labour Party, were constantly struggling to win hard-earned freedoms from an oppressive, an anti-democratic monarchy. Whereas it was simply not like that. For example, I bet this is something you didn't know. At the Battle of Edge Hill, the first battle of the Civil War, there were far more aristocrats on the parliamentary side than there were on the king's side. And the reason was that in many ways the parliamentary rebellion was a rebellion of the old aristocracy against a monarchy whose politics they didn't like. And it was also a rebellion, of course, of Puritans against a monarchy that they thought was too tolerant of what they thought of as popery. In other words, which was not hard line enough on religious matters. And it's the supposedly freedom-loving Puritans who start burning witches. Charles I didn't burn any witches. There was no witch burnings in Charles I's reign. The Puritans burnt more witches than at any time the whole of the rest of our history put together. They were not nice people to be governed by. And most people knew that at the time. That's why they were so heartily glad to get rid of them.
So why has the Whig version of history been so powerful? Who are the historians who helped it prevail?
Well, the great Whig historian is Macaulay, right. A Liberal MP, who quite openly said, this is the history of our party. And this was a time in which the Liberal Party was the dominant political force in British politics. That's to say, well, much of the 19th century, from the 1830s, most of the time up to the 1880s. So he's going along with the what seems to be the tide of history. And of course, the huge stress on Parliament as the sole source of our liberties was very much in the interest of a Liberal Party and its attempt to present itself as the sole defender of liberty. Of course, many of our liberties come from the Crown. The common law was created by royal judges. Many of the things that we think of as our fundamental liberties, like habeas corpus, of course Magna Carta, okay, that was taken from the king, but not by Parliament. There wasn't a Parliament then. Habeas corpus was a common law practice. So it's not true that all of our liberties had to be won by Parliament, or that all our liberties were torn from a reluctant Crown.
Which brings me to another thing that I later on in the book. Let's set the scene first. You remember the opening ceremony for the Olympics?
Yes, I do.
Staged by Danny Boyle, the film director of Train Spotting and others. And Danny Boyle's version of English history, apart from the scene where the NHS was celebrated by lots of sort of children dancing up and down on beds.
I thought that was the big scene.
That was, yeah. So there was a scene in the Olympic opening ceremonies where Danny Boyle shows England's green and pleasant land, where I suppose Strephon and Chloe are dancing,
yes,
and in their prelapsarian idyll, and then suddenly these vile chimneys emerge like belching phalluses out of the landscape, and we're invited to believe that the Industrial Revolution was where it all went wrong.
Do you think that was the point? Because I felt he was rather proud of these great chimneys and this red-hot steel and so on.
He's a lefty. He's a Scottish. Is he a Scottish lefty? Probably.
That I don't know.
If he thinks the Industrial Revolution, if he thinks the Industrial Revolution was a good thing, he is, I would say, unlike almost every other left-wing person in the world, because they do. There was this. If you ask most people about the Industrial Revolution, they would say, children up up chimneys and exploitation, would they not?
They would. Of course, children going up chimneys was before the Industrial Revolution. And I did find out that you'll probably guess this, during the Industrial Revolution, the most dangerous trade where life expectancy was lowest was not working in any factories or workshop, it was keeping a pub. That was the thing that really cut your life short.
What, because of the
I expect because you drank too much.
Yes.
But, well, I mean, I was brought up to believe this too, and of course, it's an attractive view which we like to indulge. We love our villages, we love our countryside. We don't really like our towns, but I think what really happened is, first of all, there was already a great deal of commercial development in England. Wages were already very high, and people were keen to earn more money and buy more goods. And then, of course, it turned out we had a lot of coal. That's what caused it to happen. Now, what happened to the people? Well, okay, living in smoky towns was not very nice, but then living in starving villages was also not very nice. But the thing that I did discover, which I admit I didn't know at all, was some economic historians do heroic work in working out all these figures. If you compare wage levels in England with the rest of Europe and with other parts of the world, India, China, you find that even at the worst part of the Industrial Revolution, they're 2 or 3 times as high as in European countries, and several times as high as in India or China. This is before the time when we're supposed to have destroyed the Indian economy. This is in the 18th century. And the fact is that there was a period in which wages were pretty stagnant, but economic historians now pretty well agree that that's because the population was booming. It's the highest, the fastest period of population growth in our history is the late 18th and early 19th century. So what the Industrial Revolution is doing, in fact, is preventing all these people from starving, which is what they were doing in cities like Naples and Vienna and St. Petersburg. So the choice was factories and mills and so on, or staying on the farm and slowly starving to death. And I think people at the time had no doubt which they thought was better. If you look at things that were written by workers, there are workers' letters and workers' diaries that survive. You don't at all get this terribly pessimistic view of the Industrial Revolution. They think of it as a time in which there was more work, higher wages, and so on.
So was it in that case history hijacked by politically motivated people?
Yes, in a word,
who
yes.
was responsible for this?
Well, it was partly people who were nostalgic for a rural society.
Yeah.
It was partly the sort of left wing of the Liberal Party and the early years of the Labour Party. It was people like famous, for those who know about these sort of things, Sidney and Beatrice Webb, the founders of the Fabian Society.
Yeah.
And the people who accepted that kind of view, that we were living in a horribly decadent and immoral society, which had been caused by urbanisation and the growth of an industrial working class.
Did nobody challenge this? Where were the James Delingpoles of the day?
It seems that they are mainly taken in by this. And of course, once you get to... and a lot of this comes, and I think when it gets through to a popular audience, a lot of it's during the interwar period. The period of when there genuinely was depression all over the world, and so there's a sense that people are saying, all our problems that we have now are due to the awfulness of the Industrial Revolution, and it was overtly political. One of the most widely read pessimistic writers, if one can call them that, said something like, our job is to destroy the self-satisfaction of the ruling class, to show that they are people who are always exploiting the workers. No doubt some of them were, as they do today. But the idea that this is purely a history of impoverishment, exploitation, dispossession is a hugely exaggerated and distorted history.
Before we close this section, you've just suddenly put a thought into my head. One of the most overrated plays I've ever come across. J.B. Priestley's An Inspector Calls, which is just that mindset in excelsis, isn't it?
Yes. Of course, workers in Britain, unlike workers in Russia or in Germany, were not helpless. We were the first country in which there was there were workers' organisations, self-help organisations, friendly societies, building societies, burial clubs, all that sort of thing, but also, of course, trade unions, which were, at that time, not dominated by an anti-capitalist, Marxist or post-Marxist minority, but which were largely run by Methodist lay preachers and so on, mostly members of the Liberal Party, who were not at all enemies of the system, but who thought that workers, especially respectable, hard-working workers, should have a place within it. And no one objected to this. The Tory Party certainly didn't. But what I think has changed is that, dare I say it, that the left since the middle of the 20th century has become much more fixed on welfare and on the public sector than was the old Labour Party and the old trade union movement, which was, after all, the representations of an industrial working class, which in many cases were keen to get on, to educate themselves, to run their own affairs, and not to be patronised and not to become dependent on the state. They were people who thought of themselves as respectable workers. And indeed, the trade unions are often very tough on shirkers. They didn't want people to get benefits if they were not really genuinely working. So you'd get trade union leaders going round to people's houses and saying, why are you not at work today? That kind of thing. And the friendly societies, the whole network of workers' self-help, was actually not very understanding of people they didn't think were pulling their weight.
You're listening to the Delingpole podcast with me, James Delingpole, and my incredibly special guest, Professor Robert Toombs, author of The English and Their History, and actually lots of other books about French history as well. What's your French book called?
Well, there's one called there's one just called France, 1814 to 1914. There's one called The War Against Paris. There's one called, which I think is the best one, if anyone's interested, is called, which my wife and I wrote together, is called That Sweet Enemy. It's about the relations between us and the French.
I'm going to read it. Okay, more in a moment.
Check out the official Breitbart store today. Store.breitbart.com is the home for the brand new official Breitbart store. Head there now for products for women and men, like t-shirts, baseball tees, tank tops, hoodies, and hats, or an unapologetically American belt buckle. Store.breitbart.com has these items and many more, so get your gear now at store.breitbart.com. This is Delingpole, a Breitbart.com podcast. Here once again is James Delingpole.
Welcome back to the Delingpole podcast with me, James Delingpole, and my very special guest, Professor Robert Toombs. Now, we're sitting in the courtyard outside of the British Museum, a prime terrorist target the day after the awful Manchester bombing, and the security was really tight, wasn't it?
Yeah.
I do sometimes feel in my darker moments that Western civilization has had its day, and that now it's all downhill from here. And I think that part of the problem is that we don't seem to value our achievements as we ought. Do you think there's anything in that?
Could I answer that slightly obliquely? I think one thing studying history does is make you at least skeptical about things, that either the idea that things are getting better and better or the idea that things are getting worse and worse. I would have thought we were in a much less bad position than we were in the 1930s, let's say. I think we'd agree about that. When most people thought that democracy was finished, that that liberalism was a dead creed, that the future was in the hands of, either fascist or communist dictatorships, and that we were essentially on the way out. Well, in a way, there isn't another game in town, as Francis Fukuyama said. He said it was the end of history. It turned out not to be that. But there isn't really an ideology that challenges Western liberalism, and however half-hearted we sometimes are in asserting its values or defending it, there isn't anything like the danger that existed from Nazi Germany or from Soviet Russia.
I suppose that we were, in England, and of course America in an even greater extent, rather spoiled during the Second World War and the First World War in that we had sea separating us from the really nasty stuff. I mean, I imagine if you were Polish in World War II, or if you were a Jew anywhere in occupied Europe, it was considerably worse than...
Infinitely worse.
Infinitely worse. So we do have a slightly privileged perspective.
We do.
I wanted to ask you about your real special subject, which is France, and I wanted to invite you to share my despair about what's happened to the country. That when I was growing up, France was considered pretty much the apogee of culture, the apogee of gastronomy, the apogee of... It was just, everything was better, everything was more glamorous. They had the fashion designers. Paris was a more glamorous place than London. And now I look at France and I think, I'm bloody glad I haven't got a house there. Well, you probably have got a house.
No, I haven't, no. My wife never wanted one, though she's French. She didn't want to spend all our holidays in the same place, for what that's worth.
But in our lifetime,
yes,
we've seen...
you're absolutely right. And I mean, in a nutshell, risking a very crude generalisation, I think that France had a wonderful period of recovery after the Second World War, in which it was economically dynamic, its population was growing, its political influence in the world, not only in Europe but throughout the world, was quite high. And then that stopped in the 1970s, partly because its economy slowed down. And I think in a way the French have never managed to know how to face up to the challenges that we faced up to more or less well in the 1980s and 90s. And I think the French reaction is to try to cling on to what they've got. And if you do that, you find, as you say, that Paris seems rather dull, that French arts and French designs seem rather no longer very exciting. And I think it's partly this defensiveness that all change is going to be for the worse. And if you take that attitude, then all change will be for the worse.
So you're saying France is stuffed because it never had Margaret Thatcher?
Well, there are quite a few people in France who say what France needs is a Margaret Thatcher. The trouble is the French have not got to the point of thinking that that's what they want. Okay, you might say that most people in this country are never very sure that's what they wanted, but our system, of course, does give a very determined minority quite a lot of scope. In France, I doubt that a Margaret Thatcher would ever have got elected president.
I think you're right. Not just for psephological reasons, the way the voting system's arranged in France, but is it not also the case that France has always been much more into the idea of big government?
Yes. Probably since the days of the monarchy, and certainly since the days of Napoleon, there's been a sense that it's the state that creates the nation and holds it together, and the state, rather than the individual, that one should rely on. And of course, partly for that reason, though it also buttresses this belief, is the enormous public sector that France has, a very well organised and quite militant and certainly quite determined public sector, which is really very difficult to reform. I mean, we'll see how Macron gets on in trying to tinker with the edges of it. But what is likely to happen is that there will be strikes, there will be demonstrations, that there's a great deal of suspicion that any change of the sort that Macron is supposed to represent is an attempt to destroy the rights of the workers, to reduce France to a lower level of welfare, and so on. And one sees even that, even young people. You may recall a rather notorious opinion poll a few years ago in which French university students were asked what their great ambition was, and a huge majority said it was to be a civil servant. You wouldn't get that in this country, and it's often young people who are most averse to relaxing the labour legislation, although they're the ones who really suffer from it because people won't give them jobs. A more fluid labour market, as we've found in this country, is one in which people are often given a chance. And I've often been told by French people living in London, I could never have done this in France. And that's, of course, why they come here.
I do wonder how anyone in France, any entrepreneur, I mean, they invented this word, entrepreneur, but if ever there was an economy less conducive to entrepreneurship, it's got to be France. Overly regulated, overly taxed.
At the moment, I think that's true. I think they realise that they're very short of small and medium-sized companies. I mean, very big French companies, which often have state support, are often very efficient. We know this. Whether it's making yogurt or building high-speed railways or making cars, they're actually quite good at that. But it's often because these are highly mechanised. They don't employ many people. They employ a lot of machines. But it's startups that they're short of. And it's small and medium-sized companies that are able to grow. And one reason is that, in fact, a French businesswoman said this to me last week, you can't afford to employ more than 49 people. Because if you employ 50 people, you suddenly come under a whole lot more regulation. And therefore lots of companies simply won't grow they won't grow beyond 49 employees.
This is why, surely, even though François Fillon was briefly talked of as the kind of French version of Margaret Thatcher, that even had he won, he'd never have been able to do anything Thatcherite, because the whole system, in a country where a quarter of the workforce is is employee of the state, I think.
Oh, at least that. I think if you were to take dependents and people who are working for companies which are largely reliant on the state, or non-governmental bodies that are reliant on state subsidy, I guess it would be much more than that. I would guess it's probably getting on for I guess it's getting on for half.
I'm very fond of the French, as you are of your ancient enemy
and ally.
And ally. What is it about the French character that is so delightful, and what is it about it that's so bloody annoying? You can tell me both, because you're
yes,
married to
I will, indeed. Well, the delightfulness is that there is... They like talking, of course. They like talking about things. You don't usually get bored in the company of French people. They take... In some ways, they take life seriously. If it's cooking lunch or going on holiday, they do it in a rather serious way. It's something that they really want to get everything out of, and there is a certain elegance in their manners, in their ways of behaving.
How did their women folk look so fantastic?
Because they don't eat very much.
Is that it?
Yeah.
But they also they are so soigné, aren't they? They look just.
When they're making an effort, yes. But I did once, when I was standing outside a shop waiting for my wife, I did a little sort of opinion, a sort of survey of French women walking past, and I think something like 85% were wearing jeans and a leather jacket. Okay, when they dress up, they make an effort, but for much of the time, they're just as dowdy as anybody else.
One of the things I loved last time I was in France, I was in Paris just after the Bataclan, the various massacres.
Yes.
And one thing I really liked was that in every alleyway or sort of doorway, you saw 14-year-old girls smoking cigarettes. And I just thought, in no other country or no other civilized country would you see that kind of thing going on.
Well, it's true they're great smokers, and I wonder if they're also great consumers of tranquilizers. And it could be that, French life is not exactly relaxed. You're always you're always sort of making a show. Now, maybe that's unfair, but you're never entirely relaxed. You always know you've got to make a bit of an effort.
So you're always in Louis XIV's court.
A bit like that, perhaps you are. I mean, of course, the other thing we love about France, at least the Brits do, is this France that in some senses has disappeared or is disappearing, which is rural France, the small villages, the little bakeries, the little restaurants and so on, which we go looking for, and of course in some cases by moving in on them we destroy them. But still there's something about French rural life that we envy.
They've got so much more of it than we have.
They've got twice as much of it as we have, of course. The same population as us and twice the territory.
But it's very, very hard, isn't it, to find these little bijou restaurants serving,
it is
cuisine.
Partly because they can't afford to employ the staff, I would guess, unless it's a family business, which some of them used to be.
Yeah.
But no, I think it is more difficult than it used to be.
So we've talked about the French's good side. Now, tell me about what is it so jolly annoying about them?
Well, I think many people, and this is not just the Brits, think of the French as arrogant. I think that's the thing that somebody put it rather well. They said neither the British nor the French can forgive the other country for not realising how wonderful we are. And of course they don't think we're terribly wonderful. And we think they ought to. And they certainly think that we ought to think how wonderful they are, and we don't always. But I mean, the arrogance that the French are supposed to show is often, I suppose the other side of the coin from what I said, they often take ideas seriously. They're willing to be on show. They're willing to put on a good performance. And they're often, of course, quite professional in things that they do, and think that we're often rather amateur. People often say they hate Parisian waiters because they're rude, but then Parisian waiters know what they're doing. If you go into a Parisian restaurant and ask the waiter what's the best thing on the menu, he'll tell you. He won't say, which often happens in an English restaurant, "Oh, I'll go and ask."
Yes.
You might not believe him, but he'll certainly know, and he'll know what he's doing, and he'll be quick and efficient, and so people say, well, they're rude or they're arrogant. Well, I don't mind that sort of arrogance myself.
Isn't there a certain chippiness from the fact that we've beaten them in so many wars?
There possibly is. I was reading a sort of bestseller by a French intellectual called Éric Zemmour, which is largely about how we did the French out of their destiny of ruling the world. So for some people it certainly does still rankle, and they think it's been going on and it's still going on now. So I think there's still plenty of people in France who would say that Brexit is about somehow wrecking France's plans for Europe. I think the other thing is that the French have got this very deep sense that the country's in decline. Now, you could say they've had it since about 1760, and it's still there. But there is a sense that, at least for the last generation or two, the country is, for some of the reasons you've said, is not as potent as it was in all sorts of areas. People don't take as much notice of the French as they once did. They don't regard French culture as they once did. And above all, of course, that the French language seems to have been pushed up by English, which obviously it has in some areas. And, the French were terribly pleased when, was it Mr. Juncker said the other week that he was going to speak to them in French, and that somehow English was becoming more marginalised.
Yeah, ain't gonna happen, frogs.
No, of course not.
No, it's sad though, isn't it? When you think that in St. Petersburg, in the imperial court, they would all talk French. It was the language of diplomacy. It was the language of civilization.
Yes.
And now, I learned French at school, as I'm sure you did. But is it even worth learning French almost these days?
Well, of course, the Brits tend to think that we don't need to learn any foreign languages because everybody will speak ours.
Yeah, well.
Which is, you lose an awful lot, of course, if you're always relying on other people to tell you what's going on. I think, of course, France is still a great culture. And although I suppose it would be hard now to say that every educated person must learn French as opposed to German, Italian, Spanish or Chinese, there's still an awful lot that learning French can give you. It's after all the country we visit most. And if you're relying on finding people who can speak to you in English or trying to understand what's going on without speaking French, then you miss half of it. So I'd still say it's well worth, if you ever intend to set foot in France, it's well worth trying to learn the language.
It is, I think, the most visited country in the world.
I believe it is. And we're, I think, the biggest customers.
So we love each other, really. But
we have a certain grudging regard and sometimes affection for each other. And often we actually do get on rather well in practice. I think in some ways we're not all that dissimilar. We're both rather bloody-minded nations. We're far less disciplined than the Germans at one extreme, but we're far more disciplined than the Italians at the other extreme. And I think in lots of ways we like rugby. We're quite sporting countries after all, in a way that many other European countries are not. We do a variety of sports in popular culture. The French love Harry Potter, all that kind of thing. There's an awful lot that we have in common. And in day-to-day matters, I think we tend often to sort of click. But there is a sense of, there is a certain jealousy I think on both sides. We certainly pay far more attention to what's going on across the Channel than we do in other parts of Europe.
In Germany even. I think that's true. Or yeah, you're right.
We get upset if we think that the French are doing better than we are in some activity. We don't really worry if the Germans are doing better. And if the Italians are doing better, we think, well, good for them. They've got to succeed at something. But if it's the French, we were rather sensitive, and the French are exactly the same with us.
I do feel, though, we are slightly talking about a France that doesn't really exist anymore. Going back to my original rather sad theme of the beginning of this section, that it seems that Islamic terrorism has changed everything. I mean, how can you go to... Well, of course, we're speaking after Manchester, but 90 people killed in cold blood at Bataclan, dozens of others killed in cafes and things.
And I think for probably the first time in French peacetime history, at least since the 19th century, military patrols in the streets of Paris every day.
And then you've got Nice, you've got the killing of the French priests. I don't see any sign that this is going to end anytime soon. And you've got a 10% Muslim population in France. It's got a higher Muslim population, I think, than any other European country.
Yes.
And these people, a lot of them, live in the banlieue and don't want to integrate.
I'm sure you're right that some don't want to integrate. Integration has been made difficult by, first of all, I think by the very high level of unemployment, especially among ethnic minority young men. Yeah. Which is not deliberate. Well, some of it is I mean, I think there's a certain amount of racism. You know, people have often done experiments and they've said, my name is Jacques Dupont, have you got a job for me? And they say, oh yes, come round for an interview. And if you say my name's Mohammed, they say, oh sorry, it's just been filled. I mean, there is something of that. But I think it's just that structural unemployment in France is so high for young people and so precarious. And it hits the ethnic minorities worst.
Yes.
And I think, therefore, integration is a very difficult thing to do in those circumstances. You know, you live in your banlieue, as you were saying. You may get involved in petty crime or drug dealing. You're on the dole. You regard the rest of society as rejecting you. I'm not saying that they're all victims, because it's obviously not. It's not just a matter of victimhood. But you can see how, you know, how a jihadi ideology would appeal to people like this. Much more to men than to women, of course.
I totally can. Which reminds me, I recently watched Spiral. Have you ever seen Spiral?
Yes, I have.
The French? Okay.
Yeah.
So Spiral was made, about 10 years ago?
As long as that, was it? Yes.
I think so. And so you've got the scene. Spiral's a series about French cops. And so there are the scenes where they go into the banlieue, and you've got these people from Morocco and from Algeria, you know, Arab French. And sure, they're petty criminals, but the sort of danger is, they smoke dope and they're into petty crime, and they've probably got sort of anti-establishment hip-hop stars and things, but that's about as far as the menace goes. It's only recently that the toxic element of murderous jihadism has really got into that community.
Yes.
And it's like a sort of an insane virus that's infected everything.
Yes. Though, of course, you could say, well, France has been worse hit, it's true, but every country is now in this danger, as we know. It seems to make very little difference what your country's foreign policy is. It seems to make very little difference.
Germany has no foreign policy and it's still being hit really hard.
Indeed. It makes no difference what your government's attitude to immigration is, because after all, the Germans welcome. You know, there is clearly a minority that's out to hit any target in the West that it can. Okay, you might say that in some countries, France and Belgium are obvious ones. There's a sort of ecology in which this is probably easier to do. It's easier to spread, but I don't think any of us are immune from it, and it's going to be obviously a very long haul to beat it.
Before we close the section, do you have any theories, suggestions on what we might do about this?
Well, only the very obvious one. I wish Macron the best of luck with loosening up the French labour market, because the more people who have jobs and who therefore mix with their fellow French citizens outside the ghettos of the banlieue, the better.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, I think everything begins and ends with a country's economy. If people are poor, they're going to look for outlets for their mischief.
And they'll feel themselves to be the victims.
Yeah. You're listening to the Delingpole podcast with me, James Delingpole, and my special guest, Professor Robert Toombs.
Breitbart News Daily with Alex Marlowe.
Let's get Bo Dietl in on the conversation.
We must stop the immigration until we're effectively able to know who's coming into our country and why you come to America. Do you love our freedom? Well, if that's the reason why you come to America and you want to be part of us, welcome aboard. If you want to come to America and disrupt the freedom and the great country that we have, you stay the hell out.
Breitbart News Daily, weekdays from 6 a.m. to 9 a.m. East on Sirius XM Patriot 125.
This is Delingpole, a Breitbart.com podcast. Here once again is James Delingpole.
Welcome back to the Delingpole podcast with me, James Delingpole, broadcasting to you from the courtyard of the British Museum, reasonably appropriately enough, with Professor Robert Toombs, the Cambridge University Professor of French History. Now, I wanted to ask you about that famous George Orwell quote, "Who controls the past controls the future. Who controls the present controls the past." And I think that we are currently living in times, maybe it was ever thus, but I don't think so, because there used to be lots of grammar schools, that we are living in a time where people are as woefully historically ignorant as they ever have been in the last 3 generations. People just don't know enough history stuff. Is that fair?
I think it's fair. Yeah, I think it's true. And I think it's because the school curriculum has now so many demands on it that in many schools history is a very minor activity for which there's an hour a week or something like that, and only up to the age of 13 or 14. And I think it's partly because, at least this is, okay, I've got a bit of a bee in my bonnet about this. I think it's because we partly sold out, we the historical profession, rather than saying it's very important that you should know about the past, for the reasons you said, the Orwellian reasons. It became an accepted part of the orthodoxy in the 1970s that history was for learning skills.
Yes.
It teaches you how to assess evidence, how to write an essay, how to interpret a document. And it's not really about that. It's about knowing about the past, knowing what happened and knowing how it was different. And I think that for a long time, history was taught in very disconnected fragments. Because in a sense, if you were only using it to learn skills, it didn't matter what you learned. You could do Hitler, or you could do medieval Outer Mongolia, or you could do South Africa, but it didn't really matter what it was, because you're basically doing the same stuff, which was saying to the kids, here's a document, have a look at it. Do you think does it show bias? Do you think it looks as though it's accurate? What does it, and the things that in fact real historians don't do. You don't look at a document in isolation and say, what does it mean? You try to learn as much as you can about what happened, what sort of society it was, and all that. And so I think, as I say, I think we rather sold out in saying history's about skills, and therefore any kind of history is as good as any other kind of history. It doesn't have to be connected. It doesn't have to be about your own country. It can be about anything. And it seems to me, at least, that children should know about the history of their own country, because the fact is they are going to be citizens of that country with rights and obligations. And to know nothing about it seems to me to be a serious civic dereliction of duty.
I think we just ought to share that moment with the listener. It was a sort of perfect London moment. A pigeon swooped down and knocked over an empty Coke can and a plate of kind of stale chips with cigarette butts sticking in them. I think that's where we are.
That tells us something about London life today.
What you're saying is absolutely my view on history. Which when I was at prep school in the 1970s, I was taught by an old-fashioned history teacher called Mr. Bradshaw, Brad. And Brad used to make us learn dates, and we had a history test every week pretty much. And I remember those dates even now. History was taught as a narrative. It was a story about kings and queens, mainly kings, obviously, because we're medieval history. I think Matilda may have got a look in, but that was about it. And as a result, I understand the story of history, how everything fits together. I think outside the private school system, you don't even get that anymore, do you?
I think what you get is what the examination boards prescribe, the things that they think they can sell to the schools, and then essentially the things that the schools think their kids will get good GCSE or A-level results in. And I think it's really a utilitarian question. I don't honestly think that this is a left-wing teaching body trying to push a particular line, and there may be teachers trying to do that, but all that I've been told by teachers is a lot of it comes down to practicalities. A certain examination board is offering a course on the history of cowboys and Indians, and they think, wow, the kids will go for that, so let's buy that one. And also we've heard that they give good marks on this, so that's the one we'll go for. Because they're so obsessed with league tables now,
yes,
as so many of us are. The school has to get the right level of results. And I think for many head teachers, this is what I've been told by teachers anyway, everything else is sacrificed to that.
Do you do much teaching at Cambridge now?
Yeah. And I also go to schools when anyone asks me.
And do you find that the kids coming to Cambridge today are about the same level as they were 10 years ago or 20 years ago? Or
it's very difficult to say, but I think most people's impression is probably not. The level of general knowledge is much less, and they've often been taught in a rather mechanical way. It's hard to explain that if you haven't actually read things that a lot of clever kids from quite good schools write, but they all fit a certain pattern. It's as if they're not encouraged to say anything very new. They're not encouraged to take any risks or give their own opinion. They're there to summarise what they've read or what they've been told in a particular way, in a particular order. And it's something they have to try and get out of, but it takes quite a bit of time for them to get out of the habit. And indeed, a colleague of mine in Oxford said that he got depressed because because they have an essay prize for school for sixth formers, and so he reads hundreds and hundreds of sixth formers essays, and he said it's very depressing when the ones that you think are the best are not the ones who get the best marks at A level, because originality is not given credit. To say something that's different, and I've been told this by lots of teachers, sometimes the very clever kids know more than the people marking the exams, and if they say things that the examiners don't know, the examiners will mark them down, and that seems to me dreadful. Well, it is obviously dreadful.
Yeah, that's really frightening. And what about the various politically correct fashions at the moment on gender and so on? Does that impinge on your academic world?
I don't know if it's that Cambridge and Cambridge students are a rather conservative lot, but we haven't had any of the sort of horror stories that one reads about in other universities, in which militant students forbid the wearing of Mexican hats and so on. This joke story about, I forget which university said this was cultural appropriation. So I think Cambridge students are a pretty sensible lot, and don't seem actually to be terribly political.
Although I did hear a horror story that you know now that all male undergraduates have to go through a lecture when they start at Cambridge, where they're taught about how not to be rapists.
Yeah, I think I think what we call it is consent, training in consent.
And one young chap, was he in Keys? I think he was in Keys. Wrote an essay in the Salisbury Review, which is a kind of conservative magazine, saying, "Look, I've got into Cambridge. I'm not stupid. I do understand the difference between right and wrong. I know not to rape women. Why is the university endorsing this ghastly system?" And he got hauled up before the college authorities and grilled about this. Is that really fair?
Not my college.
No.
Look, I think Dons are often rather naive people. I remember when I first got to Cambridge being told by the chaplain, Dons are people who are good with books, they're not very good with people, don't forget that, he said. And of course it's largely true. And I think we're probably rather naive about what our students know and their level of experience and sophistication. But it's true that we do now think that we've got to give these classes. And I think it's largely, as it is in so many walks of life, the terror of bad publicity and above all the terror of being sued.
Right.
So, if one student in 100,000 is a rapist, you don't want it to be in your college. And if it is in your college, you want to make sure that you have a policy on this and that the guy's been given a class in consent. Because otherwise, of course, we know what the tabloid press will say. And so I think we're all pretty scared of. We're all trying to cover our backs, essentially.
Although you might argue that was moving to a French attitude to the law rather than the English common law. The idea that you're almost assumed to be guilty and need to be talked out of it, whereas in the old days the presumption would have been that.
Well, I think it's partly that our universities are expected to be by everybody, including their students, rather paternalistic, whereas a French university would say, if I were a professor in a French university, I'd say, well, why on earth is it my problem what the students get up to outside the lecture room? If they can do as they like, not my problem.
That ought to be the case. I'm
sure it's not, though, because our students live, of course, they live together, they live under our roof, as it were. And so we, in a sense, are required to accept some responsibility for them. When I was a student, perhaps when you were, we thought we didn't want this paternalism. We didn't want our tutors to be in loco parentis. We insisted that we were adults who could do as we liked in our own time. But that's not how students are now. They do actually want to be mothered and fathered.
I think this is one of the great changes in our lifetime. That when I was at university, my parents dropped me off at the gates, and that was it. And yeah, the college authorities were like the man, they were like the system. They were like, they told you off and made you punished you and things. Whereas now
we're awfully nice.
Like your mum and dad.
It is like your mum and dad, but your mum and dad come as well. I don't know whether you would ever have taken your mum and dad to dinner in hall.
No way.
No, neither would
really
I.
Embarrassing.
But they do now.
dear.
As a special treat for Mum and Dad, they invite them to dinner in hall.
Yeah.
And it sometimes happens that the parents, in fact it's quite common now, when they're being interviewed for admission, which you and I probably remember with some horror, the parents will accompany them to your door, knock on the door with them and say, right darling, it's in you go now. And so they're used to being far more protected than we were, and we live in a society which is rather in some ways a bit scared of.
You have explained a lot of snowflake culture there in the last few minutes, because you've got
Well,
both
I deliberately avoided the word.
I know. Well, yes, you might get sued, but the pampered, overprotected children who are simultaneously more ignorant than our generation. They don't know enough.
They know things that we didn't know, and I'm sure they know a lot that I
about
don't
the
know
net,
now.
About
Oh,
memes.
well, yeah,
they know
all
about
right.
dank memes. I mean, how useful is that?
They've certainly done a lot more things than I had done when I was their age.
Yeah, but if we got stuck on a desert island, knowledge of the internet would not be very high on the list of. Of course, they do know stuff, and they are quite charming. But I do really think that every child needs a Robert Toombs wandering around with him or her, just explaining history and shit. Because
Well, that's what I'm paid to do.
yeah, but to a tiny fraction of a minority of the brightest people in the country, which is not. It's the base level. Let me give you one example that really depressed me the other day. I had to go. I mentioned this actually in last week's podcast with Douglas Murray, whose new book is awesome. Have you read it?
No, I haven't, but I've read about it. In
Yeah.
fact, it's one of the things. The three on my list to buy.
It is absolutely awesome. But I was complaining about him, how I went on one of those BBC Sunday morning TV programmes. We were talking about history. And there was me. There was one of those professional women who happen to be historians and get picked up on every programme because they're women and they can talk about history, and we need girls to talk about history. And there was a guy who was an Islamist. And we were talking about how should we teach our children history? Should we teach them to be proud of it? So the Islamist says, I don't like English history. We've got nothing to be proud of in this country. All I think of is the Bengal famine, and I think of how you colonial oppressors just raped the world. And I said, look, sure we did some bad things in our history, but generally we have a lot to be proud of. We achieved many great things, and I don't believe that whether you're black or white or Muslim or Christian, whether you're a first generation or whether you lived here for many generations, that this should be anything to be embarrassed about or to reject. This should be the binding thing that unites us. And then come the turn of the female historian, rather than taking my side with against this guy who wants to destroy our culture. I mean, he's the kind of the soft face of a very hard ideology which is very destructive. She virtue signals by saying, yeah, well, I don't know, there has been so much in our history that we should be embarrassed about. And I think, what are you doing, woman? Do you not notice that tendency? This sort of
Yeah, I guess it's partly the feeling that we have to apologise because the country has been so powerful and has affected the lives of so many other countries that we feel we've got to apologise for this. Well, I think as you say, I agree with you. There are good things and bad things in all countries' history, as in ours.
But we've had more good than bad. Come on, I mean.
Well, I think we have, yeah, and of course that's a lot of what I write about in the book. But
Which is why it's so great. It's a
thank you.
feel-good book. It tells the story.
Well, I hope parts of it are. I mean, parts of it are pretty. At least I hope they intended to be rather hard-hitting about bad things. But I mean, I don't think there's any point in trying to say that.
What bad things did we do?
Well, there's
Name one.
Okay, the Indian Mutiny, a pretty bad repression
We
of the Indian
had
Mutiny.
to strap them to the cannons and blast them away. Otherwise, to put encourage les autres.
So there are things like that.
Yeah.
Sure. I think that there's no point in saying that you're ashamed unless you're willing to be proud. The two things go together. You cannot be just only proud. You could say that, look, the past has nothing to do with me. I wasn't born then. There's no reason for me to feel either pride or shame. But it's not possible to feel only one or the other. Because if to feel pride or shame has to mean that you feel in some senses this is yours and it affects the way you are as a person. Therefore I can say, I hope that I'm like some of people who lived in previous generations.
Which is how the Victorians taught it.
I suppose it is.
Stories of heroes as a model.
I mean, I'm fine about saying that talking about the Bengal famine, or indeed the Irish famine, but I think you have to do it in a way that really explains why it happened and how it happened, and not just use it as a slogan. And I think that, the problem is with a great deal that it is pure propaganda. It's often used as an excuse. Okay, I don't want to keep harping on this, but I do try to write about this in the book, and I think in some cases to blame things on the British is an excuse for other people's failings. I mean, an obvious example is, let's say, Zimbabwe, which was once the breadbasket of Africa. Now it's a basket case in a different sense, and to say it's all the fault of the British is a way of saying we're not responsible for what our government does. We're not responsible for what we're doing today. And even, you could say fairly benign examples of that. I mean, I have Australian friends who say, the plight of the Aborigines in Australia is the fault of the British. Well, no, actually not. It's your fault, and you should take responsibility for it. So I think we should not be too willing to take the blame for things that are not our fault, because it's partly that it lets other people off the hook for things that are their responsibility. But anyway, I agree with you that there's a lot of good in our history, and we should recognise it because it's true, and we should recognise it because on some sense of solidarity, and along with that probably goes some sense of pride and responsibility. That's what we build our society on. If we become simply, if Britain becomes, or England becomes, just like a great big Heathrow airport with people just passing through and taking what they want, then a society, I think, will die. Or at least it won't work well. People have got to feel some sense of responsibility and a sense of solidarity. And we're sitting, as you said, in the British Museum. Why keep this place going? Why should I pay my taxes for this? Why shouldn't I just spend it all on myself? I've got to have a sense that I'm part of a much bigger community. And I won't feel that unless I feel there's something about it that I'm proud of, and there's something about it that I should want to preserve.
Thank you to my very special guest, Professor Robert Toomey. This is the Delingpole podcast with me, James Delingpole. I've so enjoyed this. Thank you again. And
I've enjoyed it too.
Really, really buy his book. It's called The English and Their History, and his French ones sound good as well. Thank you very much. Till next week. Bye.